Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Chairman of the Board, Craig Fuller.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. Thanks so much. Wow, we've got a great crowd early this morning. This is I'm coming to sort of the end of my tenure as chairman of RTCA, but it's a real honor to be in front of you again for the 2018 Symposium. We look forward to this every year, really, to kind of give a chance to brief members of RTCA and friends of RTCA on some of the work we've been engaged in. I think we have a really great program for you. You'll notice we condensed it to one day, but of course we're incapable of not covering a lot of topics, so I believe there are 10 fast, action-filled panels that are going to be held today for our discussions. During these panels, we'll talk about the top issues that are facing the aviation community today. We're going to talk about breaking down barriers to realizing the benefits of NextGen. By the way, a little plug, NextGen 2020 aircraft is out in the lobby area there. If you haven't had a chance to see the presentation, or if you've seen a presentation a few months ago, catch the new one. It's updated for 2020. We'll get a chance to talk about assessing risk in our system, as well as integrating into our airspace drones, something that's still new and challenging for many of us. I'm going to get a chance to have a conversation. You're going to get a chance to listen in to Ali Barami today, the Associate Administrator for Safety from the FAA. You know, he came out of industry to take this position, so we're going to get a chance to find out what he thinks now that he's there on the inside. And we're going to get a chance to talk to individuals who work so hard to develop the products, the services that are really leading the innovation in our global transportation system. We are excited to conclude the program at the end of the day with some friends from the Michigan Department of Transportation who are going to talk about autonomous automobiles. That should be interesting to see how that's working and where they're going. And then you don't want to get away too soon, because up on the top floor there'll be a reception with some spectacular views of National Airport, where you can see on display all the things that we're talking about. I do want to give special thanks to our sponsors. You're going to get a chance to see some lists of them during the course of the program, hear a little bit more about them. We are very pleased to have 32 sponsors this year, and without their dedication, support, and some funds, we wouldn't be able to do this, so I particularly appreciate what they do. On behalf of the Board of Directors and the Policy Board, I really also want to thank the people in this room and those who are going to watch this later or read about this, who really make up the various committees that do all the work on technical policy and all the operational kinds of activities we engage in. RTCA could not do what it does without hours and hours, hundreds of thousands of hours of time volunteered by people from the industry. In fact, the Policy Board worked on putting together today's program, which really allows us to address the many issues that RTCA has addressed. So, welcome. With that, let's get started. Let me invite Mark, Lauren, and Steve up to the stage to join me here. We thought that maybe as kind of a kickoff conversation, we talk a little bit about the FAA reauthorization bill. I know it's the kind of exciting topic you wanted to cover just after breakfast, but the truth of the matter is that while many people just assume the FAA will keep going doing what it does no matter what, the honest truth is that Congress has to reauthorize this $16 billion enterprise with some 48,000 people every few years. Now, for those who have followed this process closely, you know that this legislation, when it comes up, is often a vehicle for all sorts of debate and discussion. Some of it even is about aviation, but much of it is sometimes controversial. Some of what's in the bill is quite detailed. We're going to probe a little bit with our guests this morning. But we're at an interesting time where the legislation is moving through Congress and where the need exists to kick off the next fiscal year to pass this legislation. We're fortunate to have with us, and there's details in your in your books on their bios. We're fortunate to have Mark Atkin with us. Mark is a senior policy advisor at Aiken Gump Strauss, Hauer, and Field firm here, but he also comes, in addition to the client work he does, he comes with firsthand experience in the unmanned aircraft field, as well as time on the Hill with a chairman who led the aviation subcommittee for such a long time, so he's intimately familiar with what we're talking about. Lauren Gardner is with us today. She reports on transportation issues for Politico. I'm sure everybody in this room knows what Politico is. One of the more recent electronic as well as print publications, but one that has permeated all of us who watch policy and politics practice here in Washington. She stopped on her way to Capitol Hill to spend some time with us this morning. And Steve Morrissey is with us as Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for United Airlines. Steve has been in this town for some period of time working on transportation issues and has been with United, I think, nearly a decade now, and has done a lot of work on issues that affect us. All three of them closely watch the FAA reauthorization bill. I'm going to step down here so they can visit with me and with you. Lauren, I think maybe we'll lead off with you, if I might, since you've been tracking some of the back and forth of FAA reauthorization. Actually, this bill has been worked on now for what? I mean, I think a year or more. I guess I want to ask first, is it moving? Are we going to get legislation passed and sent to the president? And maybe one or two of the top issues that the Congress has to still confront with the legislation.
Well, is it moving is a great question. Given the news last week that the Senate at least plans to be in for almost the entire month of August, that was probably the best signal in a while that the Senate may have the bandwidth to consider an FAA reauthorization bill this year. Before that, the calendar just looked really cramped. Right now you have the defense authorization bill on the floor, which always takes some time. Leader McConnell has said that he wants to do a farm bill and also appropriations bills, and all of those things are very time intensive, and as everyone in this room I'm sure knows, the Senate moves at quite a different pace than the House. So there's definitely a chance, and the leader's office has named FAA as one of their priorities for this summer, but that's also on a list with a lot of other priorities, and some of those other ones have gotten a lot more discussion openly among Republican leaders. So I think the jury's still out about whether this is definitely happening, and I don't think anyone on the Hill has yet to say that it's definitely happening, but they're still keeping a positive outlook. And a few senators told me last week that they think the change in schedule is definitely the best shot that they have to get this done before September 30th.
Now, I'm going to have to ask Steve about this, but before I do that, can we definitely say that the air traffic reform is out of this package for the time being, or any chance it might reappear?
The Senate has always been the chamber where the prospects for that never looked good to begin with, and I don't see any changes in that on the Senate side. And as we all know, at the House, they already passed their bill. Chairman Schuster took that out. There was that brief period at the Rules Committee where there was some language in the manager's amendment that seemed to be very similar to aspects of his plan before, but they ultimately got taken out. So this doesn't appear to be part of the debate anymore.
Mark, one of the things that Congress tends to do in these bills, and they get to be, 50, 60 pages long or more, is provide help to the FAA. Help in the form of questions they want answered, reports they want done, directions on how to handle unmanned aircraft was a big part of the last iteration of this bill, or the early iteration of this bill. Do you see that occurring this year? Or will there be a lot of direction given to the FAA about the unmanned aircraft space?
Yeah, and thanks, Greg, for inviting me, Margaret, and RTCA. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak here today. I really see the upcoming FAA reauthorization bill just building upon the foundation that was set in the 2012 FAA Modernization Reform Act. We saw some great policy guidance actually within the 2016 FAA extension. The FAA still has a few mandates in there that they're looking to meet. But as you sort of start looking across the House and Senate bills, there are some specific issues that I think have become quite timely, for discussion. One of the biggest issues that we've heard in the context of remote identification and tracking of drones, as well as UAS sort of security and countermeasures, is the issue of trying to kind of bring back into the envelope the modeler and hobbyist communities, more commonly known as Section 336, trying to give the FAA an opportunity to really give them some teeth to start regulating that community a little bit more, given the exemption that was set in 2012. Some other issues that we're also seeing across both the House and Senate versions is the issue of air carrier certifications for package delivery of drones, sort of your Amazon model. That is something that both chambers have taken a look at, and we do see some language on that front. They're also starting to explore a little bit more of deregulation as you start looking at maybe some of the types of UAS that are a bit smaller and maybe need a little bit of a lighter touch. And so that'll be a really interesting debate, just because, again, with Part 107 being out there, we sort of saw more of a risk-based approach on this, and now they're already starting to look to maybe pull that back a little bit for some different types of systems. Questions surrounding the airspace itself. Under RTCA's leadership with the Drone Advisory Committee, that question was really put forward in terms of roles and responsibilities. Sort of what's the model for cooperation among states, locals, and the feds in terms of regulating the lower altitudes, especially. I think we're really going to see that question also come forward in the UAS integration pilot program that the administration kind of put forward, and we're already starting to see a little bit of guidance on that outside of the FAA reauthorization bill, looking at the appropriation side. And then, of course, UAS traffic management. So we're starting to see the foundations of that kind of come forward with the low altitude authorization notification capability, known as LANT, and that being kind of the building block, and the House and Senate looking to kind of provide a little bit more guidance and emphasis on pursuing UAS traffic management, moving that from the basic research side in NASA and really bringing that into the operational capability and how that's going to interact within traditional ATC inside of the FAA. So there's really there's a ton of issues that both bills are going to need to really sort of come together on.
I don't know if you ever get into a courtroom working at a law firm, but you do an excellent job summarizing the case, I must say.
And I'm not a lawyer.
You're not even a lawyer. Well, that's probably why. Pardon me, lawyers. As you were talking, I was thinking, what a remarkable path we've been on the last, 18 months. It seems like maybe 18 months, maybe 2 years ago, we were thinking of this unmanned aircraft space as unruly and a bit out of control, and the DAC comes into being, and the industry comes together, I think, to try to find rules. But as you were describing it, it seems like maybe a number of things have fallen in place over the last 18 months to give us better sense of direction. Do you agree with that?
I do. I mean, really, I think that was indicative of the change that happened in the leadership over at the FAA with Earl Lawrence and Hoop Gibson coming in, and really, trying to really keep up with the pace of innovation across this industry. And I think that we've seen a cultural change inside of the FAA, really trying to work with industry and to bring this industry into the fold, because they recognize it just moves at such a fast pace that they need to work with industry to better understand. So how do we need to regulate this? How do we need to maybe think outside of the traditional constructs? How can we maybe even apply the current FARs to some of these types of operations that still need better guidance on this? And I think that relationship, in this next iteration of the FAA reauthorization bill, is really being recognized, especially on the UAS traffic management front. But without a doubt, I mean, the last 3 years and really the last year and a half, I mean, it just really moves at light speed. And I mean, it just even goes to show that issues that were contemplated a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, whenever this language in the House and Senate was originally crafted, really needs some updating, and hopefully we'll see that across the Senate consideration of this, where I would expect to see, at least a healthy debate on the floor with amendments to better reflect some of the more pressing issues of the day.
Great, thanks. So Steve, even though unmanned aircraft are kind of the bright, shiny object in the world of regulatory and legislative activities. Tens of thousands of commercial aircraft will operate today safely, but best safety record. Most aircraft, more passengers carried by not only United, but by your colleagues in other airlines. It's really quite a remarkable accomplishment. And of course, much of this system, the FAA's $16 billion, is paid for by money either sent from the airlines or collected by the airlines. I know you look at the FAA reauthorization bill carefully to make sure that you're not going to have too many additional burdens. So maybe I'll start there. Do you see more burdens coming to the airlines with this legislation at this point, given your success, or are you feeling like you're going to continue on the path you're on?
Thanks, Craig. And you made a reference to how these bills have grown over the years. And when weighing, positives and negatives, we look at what's in, what's not in. Just because something's not in is not necessarily a negative. It's good that things get left out sometimes. Looking at the table of contents on the House bill, for example, we have sort of 4 general priorities as an airline, as an industry. Safety, as you mentioned, always comes first for all of us. There's no debate about that. Efficiency, modernization, and certainty. From my perspective, there's a lot of good stuff on all those topics, but particularly on safety and certainty. One of the best things about this debate right now, having this debate right now, one of the things we're most hopeful about is that we avoid the multiple extensions that create nothing but funding uncertainty for the agency, but also all of us who have to grapple with the issues created in our daily lives with the agency. So, a 6-year House bill locking in funded certainty, that is a good thing. Chock full of the safety title of the bill in the House and in the Senate, chock full of very significant safety improvements. Where I think it might be a little bit light is on the efficiency and modernization side. Talking about what's not in the bill, I know we'll talk about air traffic control reform. There are also an awful lot of provisions in the bill that really have nothing to do with FAA. As I mentioned, the miscellaneous title in the House bill is the largest title in the bill. It touches on all sorts of things that most would call economic regulation. And those are the things we'd prefer be left out. Each of these provisions has a constituency, has some group behind it, and that's okay. I'm not saying they're all without merit, but the weight of them tend to overwhelm the good things that are in there. And if history is any measure, it's those somewhat tangential things that lead to the political disputes that result in multiple extensions and less certainty about the future of the agency and the funding stream.
Yeah, it's a challenge. So, Lauren, back to you for a minute. Is the threat to the bill just the schedule in Congress, or do you see these forces, as Steve was suggesting, still kind of maybe pulling apart the fabric of the legislation?
Well, these guys are right. It's a huge bill. And when you have huge reauthorizations or just a big package that manifests itself as one bill, that's always more complicated, right? And this bill, of course, has a tax title. And when a bill with a tax title moves through Congress, sometimes that acts as a magnet and attracts other things that don't have anything to do with aviation. There's been a lot of questions about whether or not Republicans might try to use that vehicle to include some tweaks and changes to the tax reform legislation that passed last year, or whether energy extenders or any kind of tax extenders could get lopped onto the package. That's obviously happened in the past, where at the last minute it didn't happen, but everyone thought it would, and it was a whole big thing, and people didn't know whether or not the bill was going to make it or not. So yeah, there's factors there with this bill that can make it a little bit unwieldy, and the fact that it's just such a broad bill on all kinds of aviation issues. It's not known as a super controversial bill, but it's not without its debates.
Some of them technical, and I think get away from a lot of the members of Congress. So you end up with just a few members really maybe closely understanding it and following it.
Right.
Yeah. So Steve, I think I heard you say you wanted to talk about air traffic control reform. But what I want to do...
Is it avoidable, Craig?
It's never avoidable. Not, at least not for the last 30 years. But what I'd like you to do is, and bear with me for just a minute, and I really do think, I mean, a number of years ago, well, actually when the Obama administration was starting, there was a session that Secretary LaHood, Department of Transportation, held with the aircraft, with the commercial aviation industry, and with labor as well. But I remember sitting in the audience and I listened to one airline person after another say, you know, our business model is broken. I mean, it's just not working. And I thought to myself, while representing general aviation, but I thought that's not going to work. You know, unless we have a strong commercial aviation sector, this system is simply not going to work. Now, roll the clock, forward. The commercial aviation industry and community has participated actively in the modernization process through the Next Gen Advisory Committee. You've certainly been advocates for it. You're equipping aircraft, training crews, and then, as I say, flying more people to more places with a credible safety record. So good things have happened. Acknowledging that, at least for now, reform is off to one side. What's the future path? What are your intentions or desires in the community to keep this modernization process going? And are there particular concerns you have, absent reform, for keeping it going? How's that for a softball?
Thanks, Craig. You're right. This is a debate that's been going on for 30 years, and it's clearly not settled. If it were settled, there'd be provisions in the legislation, and there's not. One of the best descriptions of the legislative process that I've heard that I fall back on when we don't get things that we want mostly is, with the way under our Constitution, under our legislative process, there are no final victories, nor are there any final defeats. So this is going to be a dynamic debate that's going to continue. When I first got involved in aviation, working at the Department of Transportation in the Clinton administration, the Clinton administration put forward an air traffic control reform proposal. It was led by then Vice President Al Gore. And I remember thinking recently, if Al Gore and Donald Trump agree on anything, we ought to be taking a real close look at it, right? So. I thought it was an idea whose time has come. The time has not quite come yet. So I think we'll continue to press for meaningful air traffic reform. In our view, my personal view, this is not an airline industry view or a United view, I think that the debate has become far too much about, whether the airlines have nefarious motives here in the debate, whether it's just an attempt to decrease our contribution or something like that, and we have, as a community, have not been able to overcome those concerns, which I think is a shame, because I don't think that's what's driving a lot of people's desire to reform the system. I think for us, I mentioned the 4 priorities of safety, efficiency, modernization, and certainty. It's the certainty part of that drives the desire, and the weight of the evidence around the world that there could be a better way here that could result in a more modern a system that's better able to move technology to market quicker, a system that is fairly funded and sustainably funded for the long haul, whatever the business cycle is in the interim. So those are the goals. The fight continues. I think progress was made here, but I think a lot more work needs to be done to convince the entire community that the good outweighs the bad of changing from the status quo.
Do you think the effort to modernize shifts more to the private sector, to operators in the system, or the FAA has done a lot. There's a lot to Datacom is an example, but there's a lot to go. It's been a partnership of sorts.
Sure.
I hope you would see that continuing.
Absolutely, and a lot of people in this room have done incredible work over the years to modernize the system, and nothing I say is a criticism of that. That has to continue and will continue. The issue is the governmental structure. It's FAA, both leadership and on a technical level, has continued to do everything in their power to modernize the system. So here's an analogy. If you're working for a private company, which many of us do, and your board of directors set your budget on a quarterly basis, or basically just said, we're just going to extend your budget for another 6 months, how could you ever plan for the long term? You can't. It's impossible. And that's the structure that the FAA has to operate under today. And so, the real motivation behind reform is to break that political cycle, to give the agency a measure of independence, so it can set goals for the long term and not have to shift course, not be subject to the whims of 535 members of the board of directors who each have their own constituencies to represent. I think personally that idea has a lot of merit if we can get by kind of these very passionate, very kind of long-term entrenched disputes about funding and who wins and who loses.
So Mark, you alluded to this, and there's absolutely no question in this world of unmanned aircraft, technology moves very rapidly. But you also said that a lot of progress had been made.
Yep.
Over 18 months. I don't want to typecast it, but you're part of some of the newer aspects of what the regulatory body within the FAA is trying to deal with. How do you see the path forward, assuming there will be a reauthorization bill?
Yeah.
Is the FAA up to the task going forward from your standpoint?
So I think they are, and I'll pick up on sort of the breakdown that Steve put forward in terms of the modernization effort within the FAA bill. So I'm going to focus on two things here. First, kind of going back to the air traffic sort of reform conversation, what I always have found interesting is that nobody's really looking at the model that's being put forward in terms of the best use case scenario, looking at UAS traffic management versus ATC, because really for UAS traffic management, you have the FAA that would be in a regulatory role, really just as sort of the central repository for data in terms of overall airspace management, but the actual service supplier is would be done through the private sector, right? So starting at the ground level, I mean, they're already taking themselves out of the service, the ANSP part, if you will, for UAS traffic management, and leaving that up to the private sector to build out. And that's I mean, for the UAS industry, that's a great model because the private sector is able to keep up then with the modernization and and all the infrastructure needs, and even leveraging the current infrastructure needs as you look at the wireless community, potentially for 4G, LTE, and 5G coming into that space. So, I think that that there is an appetite within the FAA. I think, I don't think, but I know we saw, I believe it was last week, the first CONOPS that the FAA put out on UAS traffic management, basically acknowledging the NASA architecture for this and showing what that path forward is for modernization. But kind of going back to the overall FAA reauthorization bills, while I kind of had that laundry list of issues that I mentioned, a lot of those issues are focused just on small UAS. There's really nothing in there that's I think of true substance whenever you start looking at some of the higher altitude operations, more of the heavy iron types of UAS. We saw on display just last month this notion of really urban air mobility come forward through Uber Elevate, and this is really an interesting sort of convergence where we start seeing the traditional aviation community starting to come into this sort of more autonomous space of aviation. While that path may not necessarily go from a two-pilot cockpit to fully autonomous, there may be a stepping stone in there. Maybe we're actually able to get down to one pilot. That's something that I think, again, hopefully we'll see addressed during consideration of the FAA bills over on the Senate and as they get into conference. But I think that we'll also start looking at leveraging other legislative vehicles, especially within the appropriation cycles. And over in, I believe it was the House Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Bill, there was actually some great report language acknowledging the need to really focus on, not just the small UAS. Everything above 55 pounds can actually be done in parallel. And I think that there's an argument to be made that that's really where the current FARs can maybe just sort of be looked at in a different light rather than having to stand up a brand new regulatory mechanism altogether. How can we apply that to really get these folks back, up into the airspace and truly moving towards this notion of true integration?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I know, and we don't have them on this panel, but the Department of Defense obviously has vast experience with these larger unmanned systems. And they fly them fully integrated into with the manned aircraft.
That's right.
And the unmanned systems that are coming back from Gulf states and other places have incredible capabilities, as you well know, but they have to get higher and they're larger. So that I think is going to be an active area, and I know it's one that Congress is involved in. Well, this is going to be our lightning round because we just have a few minutes left. Let's sort of acknowledge that there will be an FAA reauthorization bill. It will be passed. We'll go into the November election. Lauren, let me start with you. Do you think these midterm elections are going to change the shape of aviation policy in any fundamental way? I guess maybe some of the chairmanships will change because you have some retirements.
Yeah, that's the big thing looking ahead is seeing, does the House flip? And if it doesn't, obviously we know Congressman Sam Graves and Congressman Jeff Denham have made it clear that they're very interested in the chairmanship of the House D&I committee. On the Democratic side, if the House does flip, you have Congressman DeFazio. So when it comes to things like whether air traffic control, whether that is going to continue to be a debate, I think that will hinge on whether or not the House flips. Senate side, I'm not so sure. And you have Senator Nelson, who is facing a tough re-election race down in Florida, and also just the map of the Senate. When it comes to flipping, there are a lot more Democratic seats that need to be defended this time around. So that's way more of an open question than how people are talking about the House right now. Though no one knows on that front either. So
nobody knows. So Steve, I know you're not partisan. You fly Republicans, Democrats, Independents. What goes into your calculations when you think about this upcoming election?
It sort of goes back to my point about independence. If you step back from the debates here in Washington and look at what's going on in our industry from a larger point of view, passengers have more choices to more places than they've ever had before. Fares are at historically low levels relative to the past, historically. The balance between commercial and private is robust. We're building runways and airports. We're modernizing the system. We're accommodating new products and services and innovation. And most of that is happening without government interference, except to ensure that level of safety, which is the highest that it's ever been in the history of aviation. So maybe I'm too much of an optimist, but I think these are the glory days for our industry, for aviation. And the only thing that can get in the way of that is maybe excessive political interference, not necessarily governmental interference, but political interference into that would disrupt that great record. And safety, safety, there's more going on in the area of safety through public, governmental and private sector partnership. It's working. And the only thing that can kind of turn back the great progress we've made is to maybe make it a political football, and we're seeing a little bit of that in this constant election season. So I'm very hopeful that whomever is in power, they realize that we got a good thing going here, and it's contributing an enormous amount to our economy, and let's kind of take a light touch to it.
Mark, you're going to get the last word on this. I am impressed at how rapidly the new entrants in UAS, these businesses, the technology companies have sort of come in and work to understand aviation regulation, understand the aviation community. Some of them really were brand new to us, and not as names of companies, but in terms of the aviation space. Do they look ahead and think the political framework is going to change dramatically, and will that change the direction they go, or are they kind of working with whoever is in office?
I mean, I think as Lauren brought up, I mean, the construct of the committees, that might change, but really kind of what I'm looking at is, assuming we do get this bill done, this industry can't wait another 4 or 6 years, to get the reforms that are needed, or maybe, some drivers for the FAA to continue to move forward. So I actually, I think it would be probably more beneficial to look at the UAS integration question even outside of an FAA reauthorization bill over the next 1 to 2 years, just because, like I said, we're kind of at we're really still at the lower end of the types of operations and the types of systems that are really kind of coming into the commercial market. And I think especially as you start looking at some of the larger platforms, 4 years is going to be way too long to address any policy questions around that.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I'll put in one last plug, and that's for further collaboration. You see the spirit here of very different parts of the aviation community, a very helpful, Lauren, analysis of what's happening on the Hill. I think you would agree with me that all too often in Washington, things get killed, not advanced. It's easier to kill things. That's the dirty little secret of Washington. But the collaboration from the aviation community, the bipartisan efforts have gotten us a long, long way to a really remarkable record. And I agree with Steve. I agree with you completely that what threatens it is the inability to understand one another, the inability to collaborate. So hopefully that will continue. Please join me in thanking this great kickoff panel, Mark, Lauren, and Steve. Thank you.